Arguments are everywhere. And I'm not just talking about the kind that you have with a friend or a spouse or someone on social media. I'm talking about the process of giving reasons for what we believe and for our theories about how the world is and how we think it should be. This is what philosophers and critical thinkers mean by arguments. And in this video, we're going to show you the basics of how to identify and understand arguments. This is Frank Philosophy, where we speak frankly about philosophy. So what exactly is an argument in the relevant sense? When most people hear the word, they probably think of a heated disagreement or a fight. But in critical thinking and philosophy, an argument refers to a collection of statements where some statements, called premises, support another statement, called the conclusion. These three building blocks make up an argument: premises, conclusions, and the relationship of support that holds between them. You need all three of these to have an argument. So for example, let's say I make the claim, dogs make wonderful pets. That's a nice opinion. Might be true. But by itself, it's not an argument. It's just a statement. May be factual, may not be, but it's not an argument. However, if I say instead, dogs make wonderful pets because they're incredibly loyal companions. They can be trained to follow commands, and they provide emotional support to their owners. Now that's an argument. Let's break it down. The main point that I'm trying to convince you of, dogs make wonderful pets. That's my conclusion. That's the thing I'm trying to get you to believe. The reasons that I'm giving to support this conclusion, they're loyal, you can train them, they give emotional support. These are my premises. And the relationship between these premises and the conclusion, that's what we call support. Now you might be thinking, what makes an argument different from just stating facts? Well, the key is how these statements work together. An argument takes facts, observations, or beliefs about the world and uses them to support another claim. So it's this idea of support that connects the premises to the conclusion that makes an argument what it is. It's not just about listing the information, it's about showing how that information leads to a conclusion. Now that we know what an argument is, let's learn a really useful tool for analyzing them: standard form. Think of standard form as a way to give an X-ray to an argument, to see its skeleton or its basic structure. In standard form, we take an argument and break it down into numbered premises, which we label as P1, P2, and so on, followed by the conclusion, which we label as C1. And we add numbers to the conclusions because complex arguments may have more than one conclusion that ends up being used as a premise later on for another conclusion. So let's use the dog example to see how this works, which is still relatively simple. So we only have one conclusion to worry about. I'll say the argument again. Dogs make wonderful pets because they're incredibly loyal companions. They can be trained to follow our commands, and they provide emotional support to their owners. In standard form, this looks like this. P1. Dogs are incredibly loyal companions. P2. Dogs can be trained to follow commands. Premise 3. Dogs provide emotional support to their owners. Therefore, C1. Dogs make wonderful pets. See what we did there? We took each reason, each premise, and gave it its own line. We labeled them clearly as P1, P2, and P3, and then we wrote out the conclusion and labeled it as C1. Now this is much clearer than just the regular old natural language form of this argument. We could see exactly what reasons are being offered to support the conclusion, and eventually we'll be able to see the actual relationship of support that holds between the premises and the conclusions. Now this might seem a little weird, a little too formal. People don't usually speak or write in standard form arguments. In fact, they almost never do unless they're publishing academic philosophy. But being able to quickly identify the structure of an argument in standard form is really like having a superpower. It's really like having X-ray vision for arguments. When you see an argument in the wild, you can instantly, in your head, identify the premises and conclusions by being able to see the argument in standard form when it's not presented that way. Being able to do so can help you identify exactly what someone's reasons are for believing something, so then we can eventually go on to evaluate whether or not those reasons are any good. That's for another video. So how do we actually convert real arguments, like the kind we find in articles, essays, or conversations, into standard form? How do we do that? Well, it's not a scientific process, but there are some tips that we can use to help us get from a paragraph to a clear and formulaic argument. So first we want to look for indicator words. These are special words that often signal that a conclusion is coming or that something is a premise. So words like therefore, or thus, or hence, or consequently. Or phrases like as a result of, or it follows that. When you see these, what comes next is often the conclusion. And we have similar words and phrases for premises, where if you see the word since, for example, or because, then you know that what comes next is a reason for whatever was just said. So we can use these kind of words to help us identify whether something is a premise or a conclusion in the argument, and therefore whether or not it should get a P or a C label in our standard form reconstruction. Now, another way to help us identify the conclusion of an argument is just to simply ask, what is the main point here? What is this person trying to convince me of? Sometimes it's not entirely clear. Sometimes somebody might think that their conclusion is clear, but they're actually arguing for a combination of things and maybe not giving very clear reasons why. Being able to recognize when this is happening is also a very useful skill. Now let's look at an example. Here's a new argument. The city should build more dog parks. After all, there are thousands of dog owners in our community, and most of them live in apartments without yards. Moreover, studies show that dogs who get regular exercise are better behaved. So that's our argument. Now let's identify the conclusion. Notice that there's no therefore or thus or any other indicator word that might let us know what the conclusion is, but we can ask ourselves, what is the main point that's being argued for? The writer is trying to convince us something is true. What is it? Upon some pretty basic reflection, we could see that the writer is trying to convince us that the city should build more dog parks. Everything else in the argument is just reasons why that is. Once we have our conclusion, we can identify our premises. Very often we can do this by process of elimination. If something is not the conclusion, then it's probably a premise. Although sometimes we find sentences in arguments that are neither premise nor conclusion. They're just sort of there. They just add rhetorical flourish, or sometimes they misdirect us, like when they're trying to be rhetorical, and other times they're just background information. But not every sentence in an argumentative piece of writing is either a premise or a conclusion, and it's good to be able to identify those as well. In this basic case, we can assume that these sentences are, in fact, premises or conclusions, and nothing extra is here to distract us. So we can now put the argument in standard form. Premise 1, there are thousands of dog owners in our community. Premise 2, most dog owners in our community live in apartments without yards. Premise 3, studies show that dogs who get regular exercise are better behaved. Therefore, C1, the city should build more dog parks. Notice how much clearer the argument becomes when we lay it out this way. We can see exactly what reasons are being offered to support the conclusion, and we can even see how strong those reasons are. Now, another tip. Sometimes premises and conclusions aren't stated directly. They might be implied. But for now, we can just focus on identifying what's explicitly stated in the argument. As you get better at this, you'll also be able to spot those unstated or implicit premises and conclusions, and that'll help your argument analysis later on. Now, understanding how to break down arguments into premises and conclusions is just the first step. It's a fundamental skill that opens the door to much, much more. What we've covered today, identifying arguments, breaking them into premises and conclusions, and putting them in standard form, this is just the beginning, the very first step for critical thinking. It's our first step towards becoming better thinkers and better reasoners. In future videos, we're going to build on these basics to explore different types of arguments and how they work. We're going to learn how to evaluate whether premises actually support their conclusions and how to identify premises as being true or false or questionable. And ultimately, we'll be able to construct arguments of our own. Because here's the thing, arguments are everywhere. They're in the news articles you read, the ads that you see, the speeches that you hear, the everyday conversations that you have. Being able to understand their structure, to understand how they work, is like developing a superpower for critical thinking. So I encourage you to practice finding arguments in the wild. Try breaking them down into premises and conclusions. Put them in standard form. The more practice, the more natural it becomes, and the better equipped you'll be for thinking critically about any information coming your way. Thanks for watching, and if you like this video, be sure to subscribe for more.